The one thing I'm realizing is, one, you can't solve all the problems. You cannot save everybody, and you need rest to do your best. If you can't think clearly, you're just wasting your time and others.
Hi, Wolfpack fans. It's Marcy Bullock, and today I am interviewing Dr. Laura Dalton. Hi, Laura.
Hi, it's great to be here.
It's great to have you today. We are going to begin our interview by having you give us your 60-second elevator pitch. I already know you are an assistant professor at Duke University and the first female civil engineering professor, which I think is super cool. And of course, you're a Wolfpack alum in civil engineering with your PhD. Tell us a little bit more.
Yeah, so I did get my PhD from NC State, but before that, I worked at a national lab for 2 years doing some carbon capture and storage research. And then prior to that, I'm from West Virginia originally, so I was at WVU studying civil engineering as well, but did my master's in undergrad. And before that, fun fact, I have a degree in graphic design. I was playing soccer in college at West Virginia Wesleyan College. Anyways, ended up going into engineering a little later than the average student would. So very nonlinear track for me, but I think it's led me to where I am today.
It certainly has. Our paths are so twisting and turning, going from graphic design to civil engineering. I love to hear all the changes. And you've got something really exciting coming up in the personal life.
Yes, I am getting married this summer in Slovenia.
Congratulations.
Yes,
there will be gorgeous pictures that maybe we will have to post with this podcast if it posts around the same time. Well, we're excited to talk to you, being that female trailblazer at your university. I think it's really inspirational for other people to hear that sometimes things don't always go perfectly. So let's talk a little bit to begin about maybe a failure that happened, or even when failure wasn't an option and you said, I cannot fail. How was that pressure shaping you with your decisions, your growth, and your mental health?
I would say, at least what's coming to my mind first, is when I was working at the National Lab in Morgantown, West Virginia. I was tasked to do these very complicated experiments, and they just kept failing. And it took so many iterations of trying and trying again to then finally get to a point where I was getting good data, but it took about a year to get good data. But then from there, it really took off. Right. From there, I was able to do multiple experiments very, very quickly. It just took failing and learning. So in a way, it's not that I couldn't fail, but by failing, I was eventually able to do what I needed to do.
Yeah, and when you think about that one, you said it took a year.
Oh, yeah.
So you aren't really defining that as a failure, or I wouldn't define it as a failure, but it sounds like it wasn't what you had originally anticipated. Yeah. And what toll did that take on your mental health?
I was really struggling. Plus, I only had access to the equipment every other month, right? You're sharing equipment when you're working in any lab. And there would be a month where I was like, oh, I didn't get good data again. So then how can I iterate? How can I improve? But honestly, this is also what led me to then do a PhD, because I ended up really enjoying that process and learning to write and learn, and even learning from what goes wrong, which is still very important.
The stress that you just mentioned was keeping you moving along. What strategies did you use to not freak out and have emotional breakdowns and physical symptoms? Or maybe you had those.
Yeah, well, in general, sports have always been a very big part of my life, and athletics. So for me, I really got into cycling that year. That was kind of the outlet, and then training for a marathon. But actually, I hurt myself, so then couldn't train. So cycling really became my outlet to be able to get out of my head and think a little more clearly the next day at work, basically, and think of how can I fix or try to rectify whatever the issues were from the day before.
And that sweating and moving your body is such good therapy. I feel you. Have you ever had a challenge or a question that you put forward to authority, which is sometimes hard to do because there's a little power structure between a professor and a student, and maybe you had some guidance that you didn't fully agree with relating to your path? What gave you the confidence to trust your own voice?
That's a tough one. I am very averse to conflict, so I struggle with really having my voice heard, if I'm being completely honest. Or at least I did when I was a student. I think I would say one area for that right now has been, even as, again, the only female faculty, I'm still technically the only female faculty in the mechanics area at Duke. And sometimes I feel I'm apprehensive to speak up, but I've found with the right environment, I at least have people who support you, bring up healthy conflict because it's a good thing, and to give an alternative perspective. I think one example, I've received very different feedback, for example, from my male mentors compared to female mentors, and even pointing out why those perspectives are different have been an interesting kind of epiphany for me in some aspects. I don't want to get into too many details there, but I'll just say there are reasons certain people give you certain feedback that other people may be blind to just because of the life that they've lived compared to another person.
Yes. And when you're advocating for yourself and you're observing this, what is the approach you take to, like you said, it's hard to stand up, but it sounds like you have.
Yes, I did. And I think it also comes from, again, having a healthy culture within your department that people want you to bring up if there's an issue, and being open to alternative perspectives based on certain people's lived experiences, which I hope I'm kind of bringing that to some extent to the civil side at Duke.
And what advice would you have to another woman who may be one of the few or one of the first?
Don't be afraid to speak up. It took me too long to realize that, I think. Your voice is valuable, and younger women are still seeing, you're still leading by example. So don't be afraid to speak up.
People are always looking up to you, and that is wonderful that you can now be a role model for others, because you are the first, but you said you're not the only now.
Yeah.
How do you navigate the discomfort of not having all the answers, especially in a world that often rewards certainty? And how do you lean on your circle of knowledge or community when you're stuck?
That takes me back to Engineering 101, which here's what you know, here's what you don't know. You have to make assumptions to get an answer in general. This is something that I do struggle with, particularly with undergrads, because they think there's a finite answer to many things, especially when something's math-based. Mathematics, right, will give you that correct answer. But in reality, when it comes to engineering, there are so many uncertainties, and you have to make assumptions to get to where you are. But students really struggle with uncertainty. And being where I am today, you kind of have to give them more guidance, I think, in undergrad. Whereas, and as they grow, they start to hopefully realize just how complicated the world is, and that you will never know all of the answers. So then, yes, it's going and relying on another person. I mean, that's half the reason, right? We get PEs, for example. There's someone who's stamping and doing that final seal of approval, but that's after they've done a lot of, at least 5 years of field or industry work before they can do that. But you learn from them because you learn from experience as well.
We'll never have all the answers.
No, never.
And that's something that you have come to terms with when you feel
yes.
stuck. You and I talked about a word that is a Japanese word, and the word is ikigai, and it is spelled Ikigai for anyone that wants to look it up, and they've never heard of it before. And my definition of it is your reason for being. How does your reason for being, or your ikigai, influence your professional path today?
So I've given this some thought. And one thing when I was growing up, my grandfather, to all of 17 of his grandchildren, would always say, will you ever amount to anything? It was something he asked us all the time. And I realized, I think that played a really important role in my life, now looking back. Not that it was a lot of pressure to be successful or anything like that, just, both sides of my grandparents really both set great examples for hard work and just being a good person. And I think both of these aspects, it just instilled me wanting to be a good role model, for example, like my younger cousins when I was younger. But then moving forward, I think other women, specifically in STEM, as I transitioned into a STEM field. trying to be, I don't know, show up, do your best, and really just trying to show other women that they can be successful as well, or they can be whatever they want to be.
Yeah, and when you think about that question you got, it stuck in your mind and it continued to maybe motivate you in some way to say, I'm going to amount to a lot.
Yeah, I guess.
Fantastic. Yeah. So when you think about your reason for being, the role model comes back into play. And as you are a role model and you have advisees in your lab that you are now overseeing, the tables are turned from when you were the student and you were working with the advisor. What are some things you've learned about that relationship and how important it is that could help other students or faculty to improve?
Yeah. So I've been advising my first PhD students for about 1.5 years as of now. And one thing I will say is all students are different, and it's a two-way street. Students need to communicate to their advisors expectations, and obviously advisors need to be communicating expectations clearly to the students as well. If you don't set boundaries early, that can become very difficult. So I think just having those, I don't want to say difficult conversations, but sitting down, at least setting those boundaries early, or if whatever that work-life balance might be, or understanding someone's maybe personal situation for or reasons that, you know, they work this hour to this hour, whatever that may be. And not that it's easy, but trying to find the right way to motivate students is, again, a two-way street, because at least as an advisor, I can say my students are very different. They are motivated by different questions, by being pushed in different ways. But at the end of the day, you have to make progress, and I think that starts with having a good relationship with your advisor.
Yeah, setting those boundaries and talking about difficult things such as your capacity limits are so important. Right. Are there any questions that you ask to try and see if there's a fit? Because I guess it's like any job interview. This person will be my boss, and I'll be spending more of my waking hours with them than my own loved ones. So what is the best way to make a decision on that fit?
Yeah, so for me, I'm an experimentalist. So what that means is I'm, in a lab trying new things, at least when I was doing a lot of studies. I still get to do some of that, but not as much now. But training students to be experimentalists, the one question I've started asking during interviews is, tell me about a time where something was not working and you had to troubleshoot it on the fly, because that is everyday life as an experimentalist. Something will go wrong and you have to be able to adapt and figure it out. And your advisor will not be there to tell you exactly what to do. And that's really part of your growth, especially, again, as a lab experimentalist. So that's my biggest question right now that I'm asking students.
That's an important one, because that gets at you are going to have to figure it out by yourself, but also know when to ask the right questions of your advisor so that you don't go down a really long path that is causing a lot of delays. Yes. Any tips on that to people that are like, wait, how do I find that balance between having my hand held and also just going rogue?
It's a tough question. I would say, well, okay, I meet with my students weekly. I like to know if something's going wrong, but I also want you to come with me with solutions for what you think and how you think or they think they should address the situation. So at least if you are coming to me to ask a question because you are stuck, even if it's the day of, the day after, I hope you have thought about a way to rectify whatever issue you're having. And then I'm more than happy to help. I mean, it's the same thing with like an assignment. If you come to me asking for help, bring me the work you've done. I'm not just going to give you the answer. So that's my approach.
I like that approach. Now, in your work, you are very focused on sustainability. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering, Laura, if you can tell us a little bit about a shift that you've personally made or professionally that has helped you live a more sustainable life. And how can we as a community build momentum through these micro changes?
Yeah. So for me, I think many people would probably say I'm a workaholic. I'm not going to lie. But to really, well, okay, one, during my PhD, what I did, I got a dog. It forced me to go home. It forced me to have to get outside, take a break. And that's kind of how I found somewhat of a work-life balance during my PhD. Now that I'm a professor, I will say I struggle with time management like anybody else, but the one thing I'm realizing is, one, you can't solve all the problems. You cannot save everybody, and you need rest to do your best. If you can't think clearly, you're just wasting your time and others. So I always make it a point to get enough sleep. That is what's valuable to me. I make sure to work out about 4 days a week. Again, that's what works for me. And then just making sure to make time for my partner and my dogs. And yeah, and family is very important to me too. So at least always having a trip plan to go see them as well.
I appreciate that, hearing how you have all these things outside of the quote workaholic persona, because workaholic has a few different definitions in my mind. One is an engaged workaholic where you just love what you're doing. And that strikes me as you.
Right. Yes, that's true. And I want to make progress. I want to see, yeah, I'm excited to see what actually comes from different experiments as well. And if you get into what I do, we have a lot of data. So there's something new every day. So sometimes you have to just set it down and come back to it on Monday, you know.
Making time for yourself, your dog, your family, and physically taking care of your body, all of that sounds like it's so important for you, and everyone has to figure out what their non-negotiables are. Mm-hmm. All right, we've come to our final question, which is the time machine question. So are you ready to hop in?
Yeah.
All right, here we go. We're going to zoom into the year 2035. So we're going to give ourselves a whole decade of life experience. And I'll ask you, what does Dr. Laura Dalton of today need to hear from her future self?
That everything will be okay. If one thing slips, it's probably not going to matter in 10 years. I hope that I've reached tenure. That is one thing I'm hoping within the next 10 years, and that my group is genuinely adding value and impact within the world of mitigating climate change in some way.